The invitation nobody expected. The rain was heavy that evening when Sundar Pichai stepped out of his car, his umbrella struggling to stay open against the wind. The city lights flickered on the wet street. The invitation card, now slightly damp in his hand, felt strange, heavier than he expected. On it in gold letters were the words, "Exclusive Gala for Visionaries." No one knew how it had arrived at his office. No one claimed to have sent it. But what caught his attention wasn't the fancy font or the famous venue. It was the handwritten note at the bottom. It said, "Come as yourself, not as the world sees you. Only then will you see them for who they are." Sundar wasn't sure what it meant. But something inside him, maybe curiosity, maybe a quiet unease, told him to go. So he did. He left his expensive suit at home and wore a plain dark sweater, simple shoes, and no watch. He combed his hair back and wore glasses without prescription. To look different. He didn't want anyone to recognize him, not tonight. As he walked into the grand hall, chandeliers sparkled above him. Laughter and music filled the air. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in shimmering gowns stood in circles, holding glasses of wine, whispering to each other. No one noticed him. He felt invisible at first. He thought it was a good thing. No cameras, no reporters, no handshakes from strangers trying to impress him. Just freedom. But then he started to hear things, words he wouldn't have heard if. People knew he was Sundar Pichai near the entrance. A man in a white suit leaned toward another guest and whispered, "Look at that one." Probably someone's assistant. Why let these nobodies in? It ruins the vibe. Sundar stood only a few feet away. He smiled quietly to himself, though his stomach turned a little. He walked further in. There was a long table filled with golden plates and tall candles. At the center was a group of people laughing loudly. A woman in a red dress tossed her hair back and said, "I heard they even invite charity cases now." It's cute, I suppose, but also sad. Sundar looked down at his sweater and wondered if she was talking about him. He kept walking. On the far side of the room, a waiter nearly dropped a tray. The glasses shattered on the floor. Everyone stopped. A tall man with a sharp jawline barked, "Idiot. Do you even know what you're doing here? People like you don't belong." The waiter bowed his head and scrambled to pick up the pieces. Sundar felt a heat in his chest. He wanted to step in, but he kept quiet. For now, he noticed a corner where no one stood. He walked there and leaned against the wall, watching. From here, he could see the whole room, the elegance, the beauty, but also the ugliness hiding beneath it. Then something strange happened. An old man in a simple gray suit shuffled up to him and said, "You're the only one here who isn't pretending." Sundar looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" The old man smiled faintly. "Just watch, you'll understand." Before Sundar could ask more, the man walked away and disappeared into the crowd. A moment later, a loud bell rang and the lights dimmed. A voice announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guest of honor." Sundar expected someone powerful to appear. But instead, the curtains opened to reveal a young boy, maybe 12 years old, standing alone on the stage. He wore a simple white shirt and held a violin. The boy began to play. The music filled the room. It was soft at first, then fierce, then tender again. Sundar could feel the pain and hope in every note. The boy's eyes were closed and his hands trembled, but he didn't stop. When he finished, there was silence. Then hesitant applause. Some people smiled politely. Others checked their phones. The boy bowed and left the stage. Sundar clapped. Longer than anyone else. When the lights came back up, Sundar noticed something even stranger. The boy was standing at the back of the room now, alone, wiping tears from his eyes. No one spoke to him. Not one person. Sundar walked over. "You played beautifully," he said softly. The boy looked up, startled. "Thank you." "But they didn't like it, did they?" Sundar shook his head. "They just didn't hear it the way I did." The boy smiled faintly. "You're different." Before Sundar could reply, someone tapped him on the shoulder. It was a woman with cold eyes and a clipboard. "Excuse." She said. "You're not supposed to be in this section. The staff area is over there." Sundar stared at her, feeling a strange mix of anger and amusement. She thought he was staff, but before he could say anything, the boy whispered, "You should leave. If they find out who you really are, it'll get worse." That stopped him. "Who told you who I really am?" Sundar asked, but the boy only smiled mysteriously and slipped away into the crowd. Sundar stood there, his heart beating faster now. What did the boy know? Who was the old man? And why did everyone in this room seem so blind? Then he heard it. A voice from behind the curtains. "Don't worry. He won't last long here. People never do." The words froze him. He didn't recognize the voice, but the tone was clear. Disdain, contempt. He turned sharply, but the speaker was already gone. And then, in the corner of the room, he noticed something he hadn't before. A door slightly ajar. With a faint golden light spilling out, he took a step toward it, and stopped. Because suddenly he felt that all the answers he wanted, and some he might not, were waiting behind that door. The golden door in the hidden room, the golden light. Behind the slightly open door flickered softly, almost as if it was breathing. Sundar stood very still, his fingers at his sides, feeling the heat of his own heartbeat rise to his ears. The crowd around him laughed and clinked glasses, completely unaware that he was no longer part of their world. It felt like the rest of the party had blurred into nothing but noise, and all that remained was that faint light spilling across the marble floor. He thought about walking away. He thought about returning to the quiet corner where no one noticed him. But something about the way the boy had looked at him, those tired, knowing eyes, and the way the old man's voice had trembled when he said, "Just watch, you'll understand," made Sundar take one more step forward. He put his hand on the door. It felt warm, as if someone had touched it just before him. For a moment, he wondered if it would creak and draw attention, but it opened without a sound. The room beyond was nothing like the ballroom. There were no chandeliers, no laughter, no champagne. It was smaller, lit by a few golden lamps along the walls, and lined with rows of old wooden chairs facing a single platform at the front. Thick velvet curtains hung on the walls, muffling the sound of the party outside, and the air smelled faintly of dust and something sweet. Maybe flowers, maybe old paper. There were people inside already. Not many, maybe 7 or 8, all seated quietly, all dressed plainly, none of them looking up when he entered. They each held something in their hands, a notebook, a photograph, a letter, and their heads were bent low, as though in prayer. Sundar froze in the doorway, unsure if he was supposed to be here. But then, from the shadows at the edge of the platform, the old man from earlier stepped out. His face was clear now, thin but gentle, eyes sharp and watchful. He nodded once at Sundar, then motioned for him to sit. Hesitating only briefly, Sundar walked to the back row and sat down. The chair creaked slightly under him. No one else moved when the old man began to speak. His voice was quiet but carried easily through the room. "Welcome," he said. "You are here because you chose to see what others look away from. This is the place for those who listen." The words felt heavier than they should have. Sundar opened his mouth to ask what this place was, but the old man held up a hand. "Not yet," he said. "Just watch." Then he pointed to the first person in the front row, a young woman in a faded blue dress. She stood, holding a torn photograph. Her voice shook as she spoke. "I worked here," she began. "In the kitchen. I heard them talk about us like we were invisible, like we weren't real people. I stayed quiet for years. Tonight I almost didn't come. But then I thought, someone has to say it. Someone has to tell the truth." She paused, her fingers tightening on the photograph. "They said I'd never amount to anything. They said I didn't deserve to stand in the same room as them. But I cleaned their tables. I picked up their glasses. I saw the things they did when they thought no one was watching. And I kept my dignity." She sat down slowly. The others murmured softly, words Sundar couldn't quite hear. The next person stood, an older man in a gray sweater. He held a letter with a red wax seal. His voice was hoarse. "I invested everything I had into a company one of them ran," he said. "They promised me it would change my life. It did, but not the way they said. I lost my home. My family stopped talking to me. I worked 2 jobs just to pay for a mistake they laughed about behind my back. They still drink their wine and tell the story of how they outsmarted a fool. He swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. But I'm still here, and they can't take that away from me. Again, soft murmurs of agreement. Sundar watched, each story cutting deeper than the last. These were not just sad tales. They were compressions of quiet resilience. Stories no one in the ballroom outside would care to hear. When it was finally quiet again, the old man turned to Sundar. Your turn, he said simply. Sundar's breath caught. I don't know what to say, he admitted. The old man's eyes softened. Then tell us why you opened the door. Sundar looked down at his hands, feeling the weight of their gazes on him. After a long silence, he spoke. Because I couldn't stand it anymore, he said finally. The way they talk, the way they treat people like they're less than human. I came here tonight thinking it would just be another event. Another room full of people smiling and pretending, but then I heard the boy play the violin. I saw the way no one clapped. I saw the way they spoke to the waiter, and I realized maybe it's not just them pretending. Maybe I've been pretending too. His voice broke slightly. At the end, the room was quiet for a moment. Then the old man nodded. You've seen enough to know, he said. But there's more. There's always more. He stepped closer, placing a wrinkled hand on Sundar's shoulder. Tonight, he continued, you'll hear the words they don't want you to hear, and then you'll have to decide what to do with them. He turned and pointed toward a small wooden door at the back of the room. Beyond that door, he said, is the heart of it all. But once you go in, you can't pretend anymore. You can't unhear what you'll hear. You can't unsee what you'll see. Sundar stared at the door. It was smaller than the first, made of dark wood, with no handle, only a faint golden glow at its edges, just like the one before. His hands felt cold now. His throat dried. He stood slowly, his chair scraping softly against the floor. But before he could take a step, a sudden sound, sharp and startling, rang out from behind him. Spun around. The door he'd entered through had slammed shut, and from the other side came the faint but unmistakable sound of angry voices. Find him, one voice hissed. Now, before he gets too far. The room fell silent. The old man looked at Sundar with steady eyes. They know, he said quietly. And they're coming. Sundar's pulse quickened. The others in the room all turned to him now, their faces full of something he couldn't quite name. Fear, hope, urgency. The old man spoke again, lower this time. If you're going to open the next door, he said, you'd better do it now. And for the first time that night, Sundar felt a flicker of doubt. What waited beyond that door? What truth could be so dangerous they would hunt him for it? He looked back at the people who had shared their pain, then forward at the small dark door glowing faintly at the edges. And then he heard it again. The boy's voice, though he couldn't see him anywhere. Soft, but clear. You already know who you are, the boy said, and I'll find out who they are. Sundar reached for the door. And just as his fingers touched the wood, the lights in the room went out. Complete darkness swallowed everything, and in the darkness, he heard a whisper so close it could have been in his ear. Welcome to the other side. Asterisk, the other side of the door. Darkness pressed around him like a heavy curtain. Sundar stood very still, his hand still resting on the wooden door he had reached for only moments ago. The whisper, welcome to the other side, still echoed faintly in his ears, though he wasn't sure anymore if it had come from the boy, the old man, or someone else entirely. His breath came faster now, each inhale loud in the silence, each exhale curling in the cold air. Then, without warning, the door beneath his palm grew warm, almost hot, and began to shift under his touch. It felt alive, pulsing faintly, as though a heartbeat lay within the wood itself. The faint golden light at its edges brightened, spilling out into the blackness and painting the floor in long, trembling rays. Before he could pull away, the door swung open, silently, effortlessly, and a blinding light poured out, forcing him to squint. He stepped forward instinctively, shielding his eyes with one hand. The moment he crossed the threshold, the door closed behind him with a soft but final click, and what he saw stopped him in place. It was another room, but it felt impossibly vast, bigger than the ballroom, bigger than anything that could possibly fit inside this building. The ceiling soared so high it disappeared into mist. The walls were lined with endless shelves of glass cases, each case glowing faintly from within. And inside each case was a single object. Some held photographs, others letters, still others strange tokens like a pair of worn shoes, a cracked watch, a small violin. There were no people here. No sound, except for the quiet hum of the glowing shelves. But Sundar could feel it, the presence of stories, of lives, thick in the air around him. Slowly, he began to walk forward, his footsteps echoing faintly. He stopped at the first glass case. Inside was an old notebook, its pages yellowed and torn at the corners. Written on the glass in faint white script were the words he dreamed of learning. But they laughed at his accent. Sundar felt something in his chest tighten. He moved to the next case. Inside was a small, chipped teacup. The script read, "She served them tea for years, but they never remembered her name." The next case held a child's worn backpack. He walked 6 miles every day to deliver their papers. They called him lazy, each. Case told a story of someone overlooked, dismissed, ridiculed. Each object hummed faintly, as though still carrying the echo of the person it once belonged to. Sundar walked slowly, taking it all in. He didn't know how much time passed. It could have been minutes or hours. But the further he went, the heavier his heart felt. And then, near the center of the vast room, he saw something that made him stop cold. A glass case larger than the rest. Inside, it hung a simple dark sweater. Plain, familiar. His widow stared, disbelieving. The script on this case was longer than the others. It said he thought he could walk among them and go unseen, but the truth was, he was already one of us. He just didn't know it yet, but Sundar reached out and touched the glass. It was cool and smooth, but beneath his fingers he could feel a faint vibration, almost like a voice humming from deep inside. Then, behind him, a soft sound broke the silence. He turned. The boy with the violin was standing there now, in the middle of the room, his white shirt glowing faintly in the golden light. "You found it," the boy said softly, his eyes as calm and deep as before. Sundar swallowed. "What is this place?" The boy tilted his head. "This is where they hide the truth. The stories they don't want to hear. The people they pretend not to see." He walked closer, his small shoes barely making a sound on the floor. "Everyone who comes to the party leaves thinking they've won something," the boy continued. "But they never look behind the doors. They never stop to ask who built the stage they're standing on, who cleaned the floors they're dancing on, who kept quiet while they laughed." Sundar looked back at the glass cases, his throat tight. "Why? Are you here?" "Yes, finally." The boy smiled faintly, a little sadly. "Because someone has to play the music," he said. "Even if no one listens." The words hung in the air like a note that wouldn't fade. Then the boy glanced toward the far end of the room. "But tonight," he added, "someone did listen. And now they're coming for you." Before Sundar could ask what he meant, a sudden crash sounded from behind the door he'd entered through, sharp and violent. Voices followed, louder now, angry and hurried. He looked back at the boy. "What happens if they catch me?" The boy's eyes darkened slightly. "Then they'll put your story in a case," he said. "And no one will ever hear it again." Another crash. Footsteps growing closer. The boy stepped back, his violin now resting under his chin again. "You have to choose," he said softly, lifting his bow. "Stay and see it all, or leave and forget you ever came." Sundar's pulse hammered in his ears. He turned back toward the glass case, holding his sweater, reading the words again. He thought he could walk among them and go unseen. But the truth was, he was already one of us. He just didn't know it yet. The boy began to play, then slow, haunting notes that rose into the vast air of the room. And in the music, Sundar thought he heard other voices too, faint whispers. A chorus of all the stories trapped behind the glass, calling to him, don't go back. Don't forget. Don't let them silence you. The door behind him rattled now, shaking under the force of the people outside. But then, on the far wall, Sundar noticed something he hadn't before. Another door, even smaller than the others, glowing more brightly, as if it was alive. He took a step toward it, then another. What's behind that door? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The boy's music stopped abruptly. The truth you're not ready for, he said. Sundar stared at the glowing door, the light reflecting in his eyes. And then slowly he reached for it. But before he could touch it, a deafening crash came from behind. The door he'd entered through burst open, and dark figures spilled into the room, their footsteps heavy, their voices sharp and angry. There! One of them shouted. Don't let him reach it. Sundar froze, his hand hovering just inches from the final door. And in that moment, the boy's voice came again, low, steady, and full of something Sundar had never heard before. If you open it, the boy said, there's no going back. Sundar looked over his shoulder and saw the dark figures racing toward him. Their faces twisted with fury. He turned back to the glowing door, his hand trembling now. And just as the nearest figure lunged at him, Sundar made his choice. His fingers closed around the handle, and the world dissolved into light. Asterisk. The truth you're not ready for. When the light swallowed him, Sundar felt as though he had stepped out of himself. For a moment there was nothing. No floor beneath his feet, no weight to his body, no air in his lungs. Just silence and brightness, stretching out forever. It was disorienting, almost painful, but not in a way he could name. He felt exposed, as though every thought and memory he had ever carried was being peeled back and laid bare in the open. And then the light faded, just enough for him to see. He stood in a field now, but it was no ordinary field. It stretched on in all directions, golden and shimmering, yet somehow faint and hazy, as though he stood inside a memory rather than a real place. The ground beneath him wasn't grass, but something softer, almost like a thick carpet of petals that glowed faintly underfoot. Above him, the sky shifted constantly, shades of amber and silver melting into one another. At first he thought he was alone, but then he saw them. Figures, hundreds of them, thousands maybe, scattered all across the field, some sitting quietly, some standing, some walking aimlessly. Each figure glowed faintly around the edges, but their faces were tired. Their shoulders slumped as though weighed down by something invisible. Sundar began to walk toward the nearest figure, a woman kneeling on the ground, holding a torn book to her chest. As he got closer, she looked up, and he froze. He knew her. She had been one of the janitors at his office years ago. The one who always smiled quietly but never spoke much. Her lips moved now, though no sound came out. But he could read the words clearly. You never saw me? Sundar stumbled back. He turned, only to find another figure standing behind him, a man in a frayed uniform, clutching a clipboard. His eyes burned with a quiet sorrow. You never asked my name. And then more voices, dozens, hundreds, all around him now, whispering, not angrily, but heavily, like a weight pressing into his chest. You never listened. You never looked. You never cared. Sundar spun in place, his breath coming fast. The whispers growing louder, closer, overlapping until they were almost deafening. You forgot us. You forgot us. You forgot us. He dropped to his knees, covering his ears, but the voices only grew stronger inside his head. The glowing figures pressed closer now, their faces impossibly familiar. Waiters and drivers, cleaners and clerks, people who had once passed silently through his life without him noticing. And then, above the whispers, a single voice cut through. Calm, steady, and unmistakable. This is what you came for. Sundar looked up. The boy with the violin stood before him once again. Though here's glow was brighter than ever, his eyes both kind and unyielding. What is this place? Sundar asked, his voice breaking. The boy tilted his head. This is the truth you weren't ready for, he said. He gestured to the countless glowing figures. These are all the people who built the floor you stand on. The ones you never saw, never heard, but who held you up anyway. Every success you celebrated, every applause you received, every door that opened for you, they were behind it all, and you walked past them. Sundar's mouth felt dry, his hands trembling. But I didn't mean... The boy raised a hand to stop him. Intentions don't erase silence, the boy said, softly. You didn't have to mean harm to cause it. You just had to look away. The words pierced deeper than any accusation could. The field grew quiet again, the figures fading slightly, but still watching him. Sundar looked at them all, really looked for the first time. Their eyes were full of pain, but also something else, waiting, hoping. The boy knelt down beside him. You can still choose, he said. Sundar swallowed hard. Choose what? The boy's voice dropped to almost a whisper. To carry their stories, he said, or to become just another figure in someone else's field. Sundar's heart thudded painfully in his chest. The boy stood, holding out his hand. Come, he said. There's more to see. Hesitating only a moment, Sundar took the boy's hand. The field around them began to shift, the ground dissolving beneath his feet, the sky darkening into a swirling storm of color and light. The whispers faded, replaced now by a low, rhythmic, like the sound of distant drums. When the world solidified again. Sundar stood in a very different place. A great hall stretched out before him, vast and dark, lined with endless pillars that rose into shadow. But this was no ordinary hall. The floor was covered in mirrors, each one cracked in different places, reflecting his own image back at him 1,000 times over, and in each reflection he was different. In one mirror, he saw himself as he had been years ago, young, hopeful, clutching his first job offer and shaking hands. In another, he wore his expensive suit, smiling for cameras, his eyes hollow. In yet another, he stood alone on a stage, surrounded by applause but looking lost and small. The boy stood beside him, watching quietly. What is this? Sundar whispered. This, the boy said, is who you've been, and who you could become. The reflections began to shift faster now, each one flashing like a memory. The janitor's quiet smile, the waiter's bowed head, the violin trembling in the boy's hands, the glass case holding his sweater. They're all pieces of you, the boy said. But the question is, which piece will you let define you? Sundar reached out to one of the mirrors, his fingers grazing the cold surface. The glass cracked further under his touch, and in the reflection he saw himself, not in a suit, not on a stage, but standing quietly among a group of people, listening, his hands empty, his face open. The boy's voice came again, lower now. The truth, he said, isn't just seeing them. It's choosing them. It's choosing to stand where no one claps, where no one notices, but where you belong. Behind them, the faint sound of footsteps echoed. Dark figures, faint at first, but growing louder, closer. Their voices angry and sharp. They're still coming, Sundar said. The boy nodded. They always will. The world doesn't like when someone sees too much. Sundar turned to him, his breath quick. What do I do? The boy looked at him evenly. You walk forward, he said. You don't stop. And no matter what they say, you don't forget what you saw here. The footsteps grew louder now, the air colder. Sundar clenched his fists, looking at the endless cracked mirrors stretching out before him. And for the first time, he didn't feel small. He took a step forward, then another. The boy's voice followed him, soft, but steady. Every step you take now, the boy said, is a story they can't erase. And just as the dark figures burst into the hall behind him, Sundar began to walk faster, his reflection breaking and reshaping with every step, until the hall began to dissolve again into light. The boy's last words echoed faintly in the brightness. Don't let them teach you to look. Away again, and then the light swallowed him whole. Asterisk, the final choice one. The light faded this time. Sundar found himself standing on a quiet street. The air was cool, and the faint smell of rain clung to the pavement. Though the sky above was strangely clear, an endless sheet of soft gray, like a blank page waiting to be written on. He looked down and realized his feet were bare now. His sweater faintly torn at the hem. But what unsettled him most was the silence. No whispers. No music. No boy with the violin. Just the sound of his own breath and the steady rhythm of his heart beating in his chest. He turned slowly, taking in his surroundings. The street stretched out in both directions, lined with buildings that seemed familiar but slightly off, like a memory remembered wrong. The windows glowed faintly, though no one looked out. No cars passed, no doors opened. In the distance. At the far end of the street, a figure stood waiting. Sundar's breath caught as he recognized him. The old man from the first room. His gray suit hung looser now, his shoulders curved with quiet weight. Yet his eyes still burned with the same sharpness, a kind of sad clarity that saw everything and missed nothing. Sundar began to walk toward him. Each step felt heavier than the last. The closer he came, the more he noticed how tired the old man looked, but also how steady he stood, as though he had been waiting here a very long time. When Sundar finally stopped just a few feet away, the old man spoke without preamble. "You've seen what you needed to see," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Sundar swallowed. "And now?" The old man raised his chin slightly. "Now you decide." He reached into his pocket and drew out 2 small stones, one dark as night, the other glowing faintly gold. He held them out in his palm. "This," he said, lifting the dark stone slightly, "means you go back. You return to the ballroom. You forget the doors, the stories, the faces. You smile for the cameras. You tell yourself none of it was real." Then he lifted the golden stone. "And this," he continued, "means you remember. You keep what you've seen. You carry their stories. You walk among them knowing the weight of it all. But it will cost you. The world doesn't reward those who refuse to look away. You'll lose things, comfort, applause, perhaps even people you thought were yours." He closed his hand, his gaze steady on Sundar. "You cannot have both," he said. "You cannot see and pretend not to." The street felt colder now, as though the wind itself was waiting for his choice. Sundar looked down at the 2 stones in the old man's palm. The dark stone glimmered with something easy and seductive, the promise of forgetting, of being welcomed back into the bright noise of the ballroom without question. The golden stone burned faintly, as though alive, quiet but unignorable. And suddenly he heard their voices again, soft at first, then stronger. The janitor's quiet words, the waiter's bowed head, the boys' trembling music, the chorus of whispers from the field. "Don't forget us. Don't look away again. We carried you." His chest ached as though the weight of all their stories had settled there. He realized he was trembling slightly, though whether from fear or resolve he couldn't tell. He looked up at the old man. "If I choose the gold?" Sundar asked, his voice low. "What happens next?" The old man's lips curled into something almost like a smile, though his eyes stayed solemn. "You walk into rooms where no one claps for you," he said. "You stand where others step aside. You listen where others speak. You stop pretending. You built it all alone." He paused, then added more softly, "And you find yourself." Sundar let the words settle into him. He thought of the mirrors, the reflections of who he had been, who he could become. He thought of the cracked glass cases holding the silent stories of people who had stood in the shadows while he stood in the light. He thought of the boy's music, haunting, persistent, impossible to unhear, and he thought of the glowing sweater in the glass case, bearing his name, his story, already written. He reached out slowly. The old man didn't move. Sundar's fingers hovered over the stones. First the dark one, smooth and cool, tempting in its simplicity, then the gold, faintly warm, almost pulsing under his gaze. His chest tightened as he closed his hand around the golden stone dot at once. The street around him shifted. The buildings blurred. The gray sky cracked open with a streak of golden light. And the old man's voice came again, softer now, almost kind. "So be it," he said. Dot and the world fell away when Sundar opened his eyes. He was back in the ballroom, but something was different. The chandeliers above still sparkled. The music still played. The laughter still rang through the air. But now he saw. He saw the waiter in the corner rubbing at a stain on his sleeve. His shoulders hunched against invisible blows. He saw the woman in red tossing her hair back and whispering something cruel behind a hand. He saw the boy, just the boy again, no violin in sight, standing alone at the edge of the stage. Invisible to everyone but him, and he saw himself, reflected in the polished floor, sweater torn, eyes raw, hands still clutching the faintly glowing stone. He straightened slowly. His feet heavier now, but his back straighter than had felt in years. The boy caught his eye and gave a faint, knowing nod. Sundar took a deep breath, turned toward the crowd, and began to walk, not toward the stage, not toward the cameras, but toward the people no one else noticed. Each step felt louder than the music, more real than the glittering lights. A few heads turned as he passed, confused, annoyed, curious, but he didn't stop. He reached the corner where the waiter stood and placed a steady hand on his shoulder. The man flinched, startled, but Sundar only gave him a small, quiet nod. "I see you," he said simply. Then he turned, and the boy was gone. But the music still played, faint and haunting now, weaving through the laughter like a secret promise. And in the reflection of the ballroom floor, Sundar caught a glimpse of something golden in his sweater pocket, still burning faintly like a quiet fire. Asterisk the quiet Farabi. Golden ember in Sundar's pocket seemed to grow warmer as he moved through the ballroom. At first, he thought it was his imagination, just the heat of the room or the weight of what he had seen. But no. It glowed faintly against the fabric of his sweater, and with each step he took toward the edges of the party, the light in his chest grew stronger. The crowd barely noticed him now. Their laughter rose and fell, sharp and hollow, their eyes trained on themselves and each other, still trapped in the dance of pretending. Sundar kept walking, his shoes soft against the marble floor, his fingers brushing the stone through the sweater as though to remind himself it was still there, that he was still here. He stopped where the boy had stood by the stage, but the boy was gone now. Only the faint echo of the violin lingered, weaving between the clinking of glasses and the shallow applause that rose for yet another speaker on the stage. For a moment, Sundar stood still, letting the weight of the room settle over him. He thought of the field, the quiet figures glowing with story untold. He thought of the cracked mirrors, the reflections of who he had been, who he could still become. He thought of the boy's quiet voice, the words still lodged in his chest like a promise. Don't let them teach you to look away again. And then he turned. He made his way toward the kitchen doors, a part of the building most guests never noticed, never cared to see. When he pushed through, the room was quiet and warm, filled with steam and soft clatter. The staff barely looked up, but when they did, they froze, confused, unsure why someone like him would walk in here. Sundar nodded politely, then moved to the corner where the waiter from earlier stood, the same one who had dropped the tray, the same one who had been scolded and humiliated in front of everyone. His hands were still shaking faintly as he polished the glass. His head bowed. Sundar stepped closer. The man looked up, startled, but Sundar only smiled faintly and spoke softly. "You've done enough tonight," he said. "Let me help you." The waiter blinked, confused, then stammered something about, "No, it's fine, it's my job." But Sundar quietly took the tray from his hands anyway, steadying it carefully, and began stacking the glasses himself. The other staff stopped what they were doing now. A few of them exchanged wide-eyed glances. No one said anything at first, but slowly, hesitantly, a woman stepped forward to help. Then another, and for the first time that night, the kitchen was filled with quiet laughter. Not the brittle kind from the ballroom, but soft, real, almost shy as they worked. Sundar caught sight of himself in a narrow mirror by the pantry door. He saw his torn sweater, his bare feet, the faint golden glow still alive in his pocket. But what struck him most was his eyes, clearer now than they'd been in years, no longer hollow, no longer lost. When the last tray was stacked and the kitchen finally quieted again, one of the older cooks stepped forward. Her hands were rough from years of work, but her smile was gentle. "Why are you here?" she asked quietly. Sundar met her gaze and answered simply. Because I see you now, he said. All of you. A hush fell over the kitchen, but in it, there was something new, a weight lifted, a quiet dignity settling into the air. When Sundar finally stepped back into the ballroom, the party was still in full swing. The lights still dazzled, the music still blared, but he no longer felt part of it. Not really. And for the first time, that didn't scare him. He walked to the center of the room and stood on the edge of the stage. Someone nearby tried to shoo him off, but he raised a calm hand. When the violin began to play again, faint, somewhere unseen, the room grew quiet. One by one, heads turned, conversations faltered. The laughter died away. Sundar spoke then, his voice quiet but clear. Enough to carry. Tonight, he began, you applauded speeches. You toasted names. You celebrated yourselves. But there are people here you didn't see. People who carried this night on their backs so you could pretend. He paused, letting his words sink in. Look at them, he said. And to everyone's surprise, the staff began stepping out from the corners of the room. The waiters, the janitors, the cooks. Some of them stood uncertainly, but Sundar nodded at them reassuringly. And they held their ground. These are the ones who built the floor you're standing on, Sundar continued. These are the ones who kept it all going while you looked away. The golden light in his pocket flared faintly, though only he could feel it. Tonight, we stopped looking away, he said simply. A hush fell over the room. Some people looked ashamed, others uncomfortable, a few defiant, but no one spoke. Then, from somewhere near the back, a single pair of hands began to clap. Slow, at first. Then another joined in. Then another. Until the room was filled with applause. Hesitant, but growing louder. More certain. The staff looked at each other, startled. Some smiled faintly. Some wiped their eyes. And in that moment, something shifted. Sundar stepped down from the stage and walked quietly back toward the kitchen. The faint strains of the boy's violin still weaving through the air. As he reached the door, he felt the warmth in his pocket again. Steady, quiet, alive. When he slipped outside into the cool night air, he looked up at the sky. Gray still, but softer now, as though it too had heard what was said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the golden stone. It glowed faintly in his palm, the warmth sinking into his skin. He didn't need to keep it anymore. He crouched down, pressed it into the earth at the base of a tree, and whispered softly, Your stories live here now. The stone sank into the soil, its light fading but not gone, only resting, waiting. Sundar stood, took a deep breath, and walked away. Behind him, faint but clear, the boy's voice came one last time, carried on the wind, gentle and sure. You? Chose right. And in that quiet, Sundar smiled. He didn't need the applause anymore, because now he carried a different kind of fire, quiet, steady, and unshakable. In his time, he would never look away again. Asterisk.